Hello, and welcome to this web series dedicated to sharing key insights on tools and technical assistance based on the work that was done in collaboration between BCG and California counties between the fall of 2025 and the summer of 2026. Today, we're going to be focusing on process redesign, strategic contracting, and data-driven action. Here's what we're covering today and what we want you to walk away with. We have three goals. First, we want you to understand why these three operational areas, process redesign, strategic contracting, and data-driven action are interconnected. They're not three separate initiatives. They reinforce each other, and that's the key insight that we want to leave you with. For the second lever, we'll give you a repeatable methodology, not theory, actual steps that you can bring back to your team. And third, we want to leave you with something concrete, a clear sense of where your county should start and what materials are available to support you. The agenda mirrors those three goals. We'll cover process redesign first, then strategic contracting, and then the data-driven action and fiscal dashboard work. At the end, we'll put it all together and talk next steps. This video is meant to be an accompaniment to full sets of materials for each of those three initiatives, which can be found on the portal. This slide is the conceptual foundation for everything that we're going to cover, so I want to spend a moment on it. Think of FFP drawdown as the outcome you're trying to maximize. Three things will determine whether you can get there, whether your internal processes are clear and well coordinated, whether your provider contracts are set up to enable clean billing, and if you have the data infrastructure to see what's working and what isn't. Each of those can be a distinct gap. You can have great contracts, but really chaotic internal processes, and the claims will still fall through the cracks. You can have excellent processes, but contracts that either don't specify billing requirements clearly enough or otherwise don't help providers know what's expected of them. And you can have both of these in really good shape, but no way to see in real time whether FFP is actually being captured, which means you're flying blind in this situation. Don't know if you're doing well or doing poorly. And what the club team found across counties is that these three areas can fail together and improve together. And that's the reason why we're combining them in this one session. Let's start with the first lever, cross-departmental process redesign. When the collab team engaged with our partner county, we found something that is actually really common across California behavioral health systems. Program side and fiscal side are both working really hard, but not working together in a structured way. Specifically, there's unclear ownership, inconsistent processes between program and fiscal when it came to invoicing, quality and utilization, and administrative and claiming review. Nobody had sat down and said who does what, in what order, and what does each team need from each other in order to move work forward. And that ambiguity can create rework, delays, and gaps in claiming. The opportunity we identified was to streamline some of those workflows, to really clarify accountability and embed proactive collaboration, not just firefighting after something breaks, but really structured coordination into how the teams operate day to day. And what we built with the county were two things. First, a replicable process for leading the cross-departmental redesign effort, and a set of tools and templates that make the outcomes of that effort operational. So what is the goal of process redesign? Before we talk about how to do it, it's really worth being clear about what the output should be. The goal isn't really a document or a diagram, although those can be helpful, but it's clarity. Clarity on what each teams are doing, who does it, and how we work together to sustain that. This slide shows a couple of different layers that can define a well-functioning cross-departmental process, and I'll walk through them briefly. So first, we have the process, the sequence of steps that we do, collecting data, defining, compiling, reviewing, submitting. That's what is happening. Then the RACI, the responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed defines the roles for each step, and we'll go deeper on that. And then the SOP, the standard operating procedure documents how each step is performed, so how it's done. And that can be really valuable when staff turnover or roles shift because they remove dependency on individual and institutional knowledge that is sometimes stuck with just one really key player on the team. And then finally, there's the ways of working and the policies. So the tools that teams use, how they escalate when something is blocked, the guardrails that define what is allowed within a certain process, and that can often be what is missing. So teams have a process, but no shared norms for how to coordinate. All right. So how is process redesign done? Here is the 5-step methodology. I'll give you the headline for each step, and then we can zoom in on everything that needs more explanation. So step 1, establishing goals, scope, and the right team. Before any mapping happens, it's really important to get alignment on which process you're redesigning, who needs to be in the room. Leadership, supervisors, and frontline staff should be represented depending on what the process is. But if you skip this step, you end up mapping a process that nobody can really agree on is the right one. Step 2 is to actually map the current state and identify pain points. So building a shared end-to-end map of how the work actually flows today, not how it's supposed to flow. And so this is done in workshops with people who actually touch the process. And the goal is to be able to surface bottlenecks, delays, and rework that aren't visible from the top. Step 3 is to design the future state workflow. So looking at that current state process and identifying how to resolve pain points that you found in step 2. And this is where you can define new steps and handoffs. Step 4 is clarifying ownership and creating supporting tools. So building out the RACIs, the SOPs, and the checklists that make it possible to operationalize the new process. Final piece is rolling out, monitor, and sustaining. So training staff, communicating those changes, and establishing recurring touch points to monitor whether the new process is holding. The TTA materials in the full set will give you detailed facilitation guides and templates for each of these steps, and we'll focus on just a few of these. This slide shows you what the current state and future state maps can look like in practice. So on the top, we'll have the current state, and you can see that some of the pain points have been surfaced in red. And on the bottom, we have the redesigned future state where those pain points have been addressed through new steps and clear hands-off. And the key thing here is really that this is meant to be collaborative, not a desk exercise, and not just one person creating the maps by themselves, but structured workshops where you're walking through the process step by step with everyone who touches it. And the act of doing it together is really what can create that shared ownership of the future state. A couple things to watch out for as you run these sessions. Some people will describe what the process is supposed to be and not what it actually is. And what you really want is to get an accurate current state of what is actually happening. Another thing to note is that pain points can cluster at handoffs. So the moments when work is passing from one team or one person to another. So make sure to keep an eye on those. And then the final piece is that some processes are really, really complex. The templates and the TTA materials are a starting point, but you should expect to have to tailor them to the specific processes that you're working on. A redesign process on its own does not change behavior, and what makes it stick are some of these tools. So the map itself, also the RACI and the SOP, giving something for people to look back to reflect on as they adjust to the new process. The process map introduces the new steps that resolve pain points. The RACI makes sure that for every step, there is exactly one person in or one role that owns the outcome, not two people, and making sure that no steps are, ambiguous. And the SOP tells the person who's responsible what good looks like in practice and what is supposed to be happening. You don't need all three on day one. In the TTA materials, the RACI is going to be the first one to build out because it can resolve some of the most common source of failures, which is going to be ambiguity of ownership. SOPs can come next and should be built out by individual teams as a post-workshop activity. So how do you build out SOPs? We can spend a moment there because is sometimes confusion on what they are and when to use them. So an SOP documents how a specific process step is performed, not the whole process, just an individual step. It answers the question of if somebody new joined the team tomorrow and had to do this task, what would they need to know? What is on the right shows the 8 sections of a complete SOP, and the most important ones to get right are going to be the purpose, roles and responsibilities, and the escalation path. The purpose can ground the SOP and why it matters. Roles and responsibilities connects it to the RACI. And the escalation path is what prevents the process from grinding to a halt when something expected happens. SOPs are living documents. Build them to be reviewed and updated when policies change, when the process is updated, when you get new guidance from DHCS. The ones that gather dust and never get revised are worse than having none because sometimes they can create false confidence in a process. So make sure that they're updated regularly. Now let's move on to our second lever, strategic contracting. Strategic contracting is one of those areas that counties know is really important, but often don't have a structured way to address when issues with contracts come up. A lot of counties are transitioning into really functioning like behavioral health plans, which is a very different kind of business model than you all have previously been operating on with contractors. And this playbook that we have created and is available to you in the full set of materials is meant to fill that gap. And so the right column on this slide is telling you what you should be reaching for, and it's worth it to pause on. So when there is a variability in what needs to happen with the contracts, we need to be sure that we're changing things. So when there is billing, documentation, or reconciliation issues that emerge and can signal preventable denials or gaps in claimability, it's going to be really a contracting signal that something should be changing about the way in which you communicate with your contractors. Also, when roles and ownership across your internal contracting functions are unclear, and you need to find some of that cross-functional alignment to move forward. Another example is when contract language is inconsistent across programs or providers. Maybe they're on different contract cycles or the relationship is really different, but it can also be useful then. And then the final way in which you can use this process playbook is when you need to establish or strengthen governance around contracting decisions. Just like in the process redesign work, strategic contracting is going to follow a 5-step methodology. So let me walk you through it. The first step is going to be identifying where there are issues and pain points. So map where contracting workflows break down, where do billing expectations get confused, where do claims get denied because of documentation gaps that can trace back to unclear contract language. That's going to be the starting point. Step 2 is to prioritize those issues that come up. Not all of them are going to be equal. Some will require an executive decision to unblock them. Others require updates to contract language. Some are communications to providers. This triage step helps you from trying to solve everything at once, which we all know can be really tempting, but is often unsustainable. Step three is going to be designing the model contract framework. So, building a standardized architecture for fee-for-service contracts. What are the boilerplate terms that should apply across programs, and which pieces can be modularized and change depending on program-specific needs? Step four is going to be defining governance and decision rights. So, clarifying who approves what, who drafts contract updates, and how decisions move from executive alignment through legal review all the way to final codification. And then our final step is going to be implementing updates and supporting adoption. So, translating decisions into amendments, rolling out guidance to staff and providers, and reinforcing expectations through communication. This is going to be one of the most important slides in the deck, and I want to give it the time it deserves. So, this table shows the 6 dimensions of how counties approach contracting today versus where they need to get to. And I'm going to call out 3 that come up consistently. So, the first is going to be fragmented contract structure and moving towards a standardized modular architecture. Most counties have contracts that evolved organically, different terms for different programs, different standards for different providers, and limited alignment with the actual realities of what billing looks like under CalAIM. The future state is a unified fee-for-service contract template with harmonized billing, payment, and incentive terms that can be adapted across counties without starting from scratch and without losing some of the really valuable pieces that make a contract enforceable. The second thing is going to be limited coordination across county teams. So, moving towards integrated governance and shared accountability. Finance, program, contracts, and quality in a county can sometimes work in silos, which can slow down decisions and claim resolution. The fix is not going to be mashing all those teams together, but really defining the RACI. So, who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed, and the governance cadence that makes cross-functional alignment routine rather than something that has to happen when there is a fire to put out. And then the final thing that can come up is a really cautious or compliance-driven billing culture. We, of course, want billing to be compliant, but sometimes there is a culture of overt cautiousness about what to bill, which results in underbilling and leaving federal financial match on the table. The goal is not to bill really aggressively, but making sure that we're billing completely and accurately while understanding some of the risk trade-offs that can happen. All right. This slide shows the architecture of what a model fee-for-service contract should look like. There are 8 elements organized around this boilerplate core with some of those modular program inserts that we mentioned. So the boilerplate covers the things that should be consistent across every provider contract: common language and definitions, payment structure and timeliness, billing documentation and compliance requirements, data reporting audit obligations, and information system standards. The modular inserts are going to be where you tailor for specific populations, for programs, for service types. And that's where you can add some of the performance and quality outcomes specific to a program or performance incentives that are relevant to a particular provider type. The power of this architecture is that when DHCS guidance changes or federal guidance changes, and we know that it will at some point, you can update the boilerplate and make sure that it flows through every contract. You don't have to hunt through every different contract to find individual clauses that need updating. This should be maintained throughout. This Standardization matrix is a tool which can help determine which of those pieces should remain in the boilerplate and which should be program specific. So the right hand of this is going to be an example of how you can decide where to standardize. Asking these questions like, does DHCS or federal law require it? Can the county implement sustainably? Can providers realistically comply? And does standardization actually reduce administrative burden? And then the final piece, which is of course critical and should really be top of mind, is what's the impact on clients? Does it improve access? Does it improve quality? And does it improve consistency of care for clients? The example in this table that we're using of standardizing information systems requirements and contracts is yes on all these criteria, which means it's a strong candidate for standardization. You can use this framework to build shared understanding across your cross-functional teams and determine what should be standardized in the boilerplate versus what can shift from contract to contract. One of the biggest sources of contracting dysfunction that some counties encounter is going to be a lack of a clear, structured path from we need to change this to actually changing the contracts. And this slide tries to show some of that path. So happens in 4 stages. Leadership making or approving a policy decision, the decision being reviewed by the appropriate cross-functional teams and then legal teams, and then the final piece, which is going to be actual codification in the contract and signing it with the providers. Without this governance structure, changes will either stall because there isn't clear ownership of moving forward, or there's inconsistent implementation. And so the TTA materials that you can access have a really detailed example of how to structure this initial piece, this leadership decision-making process within the governance flow. And like I said, we mentioned just a few key pieces of the materials in this overview, but a full set is available in the final materials. Okay. Let's move on to our third lever, data-driven strategic action and the fiscal dashboard. This really sounds buzzwordy, so let's talk about what this means concretely. It's the practice of making decisions about the behavioral health plan based on what the fiscal data is actually telling you, rather than based on your gut instinct, lagging reports, or whatever is top of mind, has some of that recency bias from the last meeting. So the 3 outcomes on the right side are what you can gain by really trying to become a data-driven organization. So decision-making can become evidence-based and predictive rather than reactive. So you're seeing trends early enough to course correct, not responding to crises after they've already affected your bottom line. The second thing is that execution of system-wide strategy becomes much more measurable and transparent. So leaders at every level can see where their programs are contributing to or detracting from financial sustainability. Of course, it is not the goal of the BHP to profit a lot, but we do want to make sure that there is the sustainability for you all to expand services, high quality services that are being provided to clients. And then the final piece is that overall performance becomes more consistent, resilient, and scalable. So when all teams are working from the same data, you can learn and grow together. And the challenge that many counties are facing is not really a lack of data, but it's a lack of data that is organized, visualized, and connected to clear decisions. And that's what a fiscal dashboard is really designed to solve. So here is the high-level four-step process. You can notice that it runs backwards from the way that most data projects run. So we are starting with the actions that we're trying to have. So most organizations start with what data do we have and how do we make something to make it useful. And that approach can produce dashboards that nobody uses because the data isn't really connected to a specific decision. So this framework starts with the end goal. What outcome are we trying to achieve? And from there, you can identify the actions different stakeholders need to take to reach that goal, how to communicate those actions, who needs what information through what channel, and then you can determine how to analyze and visualize the data to support those actions. Finally, you identify the data sources you need to obtain. So, step zero, leadership meets to define the system-wide outcome that the analysis will support. For the fiscal dashboard, the end goal is really to improve FFP drawdown and overall fiscal sustainability. Step one is action, determining that for each stakeholder group, what actions need to be taken to reach that goal and what do they need to be able to do differently. Step two is share. How do we communicate this data in a way that is really actually useful? In what meetings? What is the true message? And what's the medium that we're communicating by? And what that leads to is being able to develop a dashboard wireframe with the stakeholders that are actually going to be using it. And then the final piece is actually mapping out the data elements. So determining where that data lives, identifying gaps, and ensuring that your IT staff build the data governance to keep all of this really accurate. The next 5 slides will walk through each step in a little bit more detail. So what we'll do is talk about the overall arching goal, and then in the full materials you can find a little bit more detail on some of these example outputs and what the activities would look like for each of these steps. So step zero. The most important thing here is that leadership and whoever is going to be involved in the dashboard in the end should define what the end goal is and what you're trying to get to. It should be specific enough that you can evaluate whether a data analysis is going to be supporting it or not. For step one, for each stakeholder group, so for deputies, administrators, supervisors, frontline staff, whoever ultimately will need to act in order to get to our end goal, run a structured meeting to understand how their jobs that get done are influenced by the data they're able to see. So, what decisions do they make? What would they do differently if they had better data? And this is what can help you ensure that a dashboard is actually being used, is really creating with the end user in mind. Before you build anything, make sure to be thoughtful about the communication infrastructure. Who will get access to the dashboard? What messages will resonate with deputies versus supervisors? And what meetings will the dashboard be used in a recurring basis? This is going to be really change management work, and in a lot of ways is as important as the technical build. We don't want to be building something that won't be used by anyone, will, sit on a proverbial online shelf. Step three is going to be actually co-developing what the dashboard looks like. So starting with the smallest version of this, sometimes called the minimum viable product, that can deliver value, and then working to plan the roadmap from there. This can prevent the dashboard from really exploding into something overwhelming for an IT team to create and get something useful in front of users more quickly. Step four is going to be obtaining the actual data. So mapping each dashboard element to the data source where it lives, identifying gaps, data that you don't have or can't easily pull, and then defining ownership. So making sure you know who is responsible for keeping all of the data accurate and current. And this governance step is what really prevents the dashboard from becoming stale and unused. The output of all these steps is going to be a financial dashboard is the example that we're using, structured around these three parts. So high-level financials, revenue comparisons, and federal financial participation. But you can use the same framework to build out really any kind of client dashboard. If it's related to quality metrics, anything like that, also a good opportunity to practice this framework and making sure that we're creating usable dashboards. And I'll give a little bit of extra detail on what the dashboard we created for this particular county looked like, and we can see in the full materials additional detail on that process as well. So the first part is really a central hub for the core cost and revenue metrics across county and contracted programs. And this is like a view that somebody at a deputy level would need to understand the fiscal health of the county and contractors really at a quick glance is the ideal scenario. The second part is revenue comparisons. So the comparison of FFP and other revenue streams across programs to identify where there should be improvement efforts and where we can actually get best practices. The final piece is FFP drawdown against targets and expectations and identifying gaps. And that's really an operational tool for teams that are responsible for ensuring claims are complete and accurate. In the full materials, there is going to be a link to the actual wireframe dashboard that was created. And it can be a really detailed and actionable starting point for counties to begin with. This page is really a high-level view on some pieces that are in the full materials. So what specific pieces of a dashboard tracking federal financial participation can look like, and what these materials can be used for, what each part of the dashboard is valuable for, and where it's going to be useful in decision making. All right. We've covered a lot today. So, three levers, process redesign really meant to give you clarity on what happens inside the county, who does what, in what order, and with what accountability. Strategic contracting extends that clarity to the provider network. So, what are you expecting from providers and how you hold each other accountable? And then the final piece is data-driven action. So, visibility into whether all of that is working when we consider contracted programs in addition to county operated. And this is really meant to give you the ability to course correct before small gaps become large ones. These three levers reinforce each other. So better internal processes, feed cleaner encounters to your billing workflow. Clearer contracts mean that providers are documenting services in ways that are ultimately billable. And the fiscal dashboard can tell you with a little bit more clarity, maybe than the data that you already have, where you should focus attention. And so take a moment to look at these next steps. Identify where your county needs the most help. Make sure to download the TTA materials available in the portal, and then review the playbook in more detail. And then once you've done all that, you can start to think about the groups of people that you'll need to bring together to make all of this actually translate into operational change. All right. Thank you all so much for your time today. I hope that this was valuable and that you have a good starting point for looking into the more detailed materials.